thank you very much for inviting me to chair this panel, the last but not least panel of academics talking about city deals, a sustainable model of governance for the north of England. They will present some reflections of what has been said so far. So the members of the panels are the following. Andrew Mycock is reader in politics at the University of Huddersfield. His research interests center on the politics of Britishness and youth citizenship. We also have with us Brenton Prof. He's a research fellow in the School of Politics at the University of Sheffield and currently working on a national project on devolution in the UK. Paul Greenhalgh, he's a reader in real estate economics at Northumbria University, and his field of expertise is the spatial analysis of commercial property markets and policy evaluation. And Muldoon-Smith, who is professor of politics and current head of department of the policy department at the University of York, and he's also worked on public policy issues in the UK. Thank you very much, and welcome to the last panel.
Do you want me to go first? Oh, right. Okay, yep. Right. We're hoping we're going to be speaking to an empty room. I think by the time we finish, it will be an empty room. It's interesting. It's a shame. I thought when the previous speaker said it's interesting that Bob Kerslake and the rest all disappeared after they'd said their bit. It is often a problem. In a way, it was interesting, Bob Kerslake's speech this morning, because he actually finally, for the first time, admitted that journeys that begin without a sort of sense of destination can be problematic. And in many ways, it was interesting that he correlated his thoughts with what happened in Scotland and Wales, because it's quite clear there that the journey that New Labour began did not end in the destination that they expected. And in many ways, that's been borne out in the approach towards English devolution as well. There doesn't seem to be a clear destination, and what the intention of the government, what will out with is probably down to two pervading theories which seem to dominate the approach. One, which is this belief in pragmatic, organic constitutional reform, that somehow there is a tradition which means that reform is a process, not an event. I think in Scotland it's been quite clearly proven that it's both a process and an event. If the referendum last year in 2014 wasn't an event, I don't know what is an event. Also, that there's this belief in the British political tradition, which I mentioned before, this elite to elite negotiation. And that's clearly defining the way in which regional devolution in England has been approached. Both are problematic. It's problematic in terms of the first approach, which is the organic approach, in the fact that if we are seeing a constitutional approach, as Bob Kerslake mentioned, this idea of reserved matters defining the relations with Scotland and Wales and also Northern Ireland, then the way in which it's approaching England, the idea that the debates between the four different nations aren't porous and contagious, is extremely reductive, if not accepted. But also that there's a lack of understanding about the purpose. Is the purpose of regional devolution in England to create a sense of equality, or to actually formalise a symmetry between different parts of England? The real issue here is there's no real clear idea about what is the destination of this. And I think that the problem is that if you reproduce that in England, you'll get the same prediction as you get in Scotland and Wales. Beyond that, there is a lack of connectivity between the English questions, the English question of English nationhood and the English question of English regionalism and localism. And that is very clearly evidenced in the approach towards English votes for English laws at a national level and the responses of political parties, and also then that approach towards English regionalism. And I want to really think about that disconnect in three particular areas. The first is the way in which that is affecting our connection with elected elites. And I've written about this before, about the idea that the West Lothian question is being reproduced in England. That what I have called the Manchester-Withington question, because I live in Manchester-Withington, is one which frames very much about the idea, well, if different parts of the United Kingdom MPs had different voting rights in Parliament, well, what's happening in the current approach is that you're creating exactly the same approach. Jeff Smith, who is my local MP, once the Manchester Devo deals are signed through and actually actualised, will not have responsibility for various areas of public policy. He will be able to vote in other areas of England where there are that responsibility through either of what other mechanism. And so there is a real problem there in the way in which we will connect with and the way in which citizens understand their relations with their MPs at a parliamentary level. I think that the Derbyshire-Nottingham deal also shows the extent of the disconnect with local councils as well, and that's going to become increasingly popular. If you think about the 4 authorities that are part of the Sheffield City region, they're also going to be part of the DN2 framework as well. What are they responsible for? How do we connect with them? How do we respect to the different elected mayors that are going to come up? It's absolute chaos. And how citizens are going to be able to actually understand that, 2 minutes, is going to be really problematic. Beyond that, the democratic deficit is going to be linked towards the mayoral framework. Joe asked me to comment about the he's gone actually, don't blame him. About the People's Plan that I'm involved with. There are people in Manchester who are very upset, including myself. The model of the directly elected mayor, Manchester is very proud about this, the fact that it's a weakened mayor, that it's a weak mayor model. The reality of that doesn't really matter, because basically if you're going to have an elected mayor on a certain mandate and you've got the 10 local authority mayors, elected leaders, basically sitting on a council trying to constrain that mayor, there's going to be conflict at some point, and there really hasn't been any thought about that question, about the extent to which you've got 2 frameworks with public legitimacy, and they're going to at some point come into conflict. Also the idea that's going to build democratic engagement. If you look at the turnout of elected mayors, directly elected mayors in North America, if you look at the turnout in London, well, the turnout is around 38% or even lower. That's about the same as local council elections. So directly elected mayors don't in any way energise that, and particularly because the fact that we're going to basically go in 2017 to the electorate serving them a fait accompli. There's no reverse gear, there's no way in which electors can actually say, well, actually, we don't agree with the model of the evolution which the directly elected mayors have gone. It's highly likely that lots of people are just going to say, well, same old politics, same old people, and aren't going to vote in that. The last point I want to make is about party politics. It seems remarkable that political parties are undertaking this reform without thinking about the implications for their own structure and agency. And the problem is, of course, there is talk about maybe an English Labour Party, but no one's thinking about the implications for regional frameworks, the way in which local constituency parties are going to be framed and the way in which parties are going to organise. There is highly likely going to be demands for a greater Manchester framework of political organisation to suit where the power is going. Again, it's going to strongly fracture the way in which political parties are going to be able to organise and to be able to develop common electoral messages and to be able to campaign. And none of these points are really framed together. So, is a constitutional convention the answer to that? Well, some say yes, some say no. If it is a constitutional convention, it needs to stop from the bottom up and not the top down. A constitutional convention that filters downwards won't connect with it. And so there is the idea about how do we build up. And in that point, if Joe had been here, I would have argued that that's where what we are doing in Manchester is responding with that bottom-up approach through the People's Plan. So, watch out, because we're coming after Richard Leese and we're going to make sure that he does answer to people, because there is a need for him to actually engage. Manchester is a classic example of all the problems of devolution in terms of citizenship.
Okay, thank you. Well, Richard will be pleased that I haven't really got anything much to say, because I think much of what I think has been said all day, and particularly in the last panel. And I think the contrast between the panel immediately after lunch and the last panel illustrates the fundamental problem, and that is a problem that there are actually 2 very different conversations going on. And one is a conversation that's going on between government and some local authorities, which is not a conversation about devolution at all. And I don't think the word devolution should be used in the process, because it is not about devolving power to citizens or even local authorities. It's about finding a particular way of managing local economic growth. And I think what's really interesting about this is that in the 1980s, when we were going through a very similar period of austerity, the people who were the only group that existed to block what was going on in the 1980s were the local authorities. And the local authorities saw their powers cut away. And I think what this government has done has been very clever, which is to co-opt the local authorities into their cuts. And I think it's incredible if you look at I can't remember if it's the Leeds or the West Yorkshire Combined Authority document, where they proclaim how great they've been at cutting expenditure, and that they will continue to do that as a local authority. And of course, what all these deals have within them is an agreement that if they don't meet the spending levels agreed with the Treasury, they will lose their powers. And so this is not a process about democracy in any way. And I think it goes back to the point that was raised this morning by Lord Kerslake, which is about the relationship between what's going on and the whole constitutional framework. And the fundamental problem, and it's a point that was made in the last session by Vicky, I think, but by all the speakers in a way, is that we have a 19th century system of government which is pre-democratic, and that system of government is still in place. The question I always ask my students is Britain a democracy? And I think actually, if you look at most of the criteria of democracy, Britain is not a democracy, and actually we cannot resolve these questions at the local level until we resolve the questions at the national level, because it actually needs a fundamental change in the relationship between politicians and citizens, and between the way Westminster and Whitehall works and the rest of the country. I mean, I do think that the panel of the politicians and the bureaucrats was incredible, because you couldn't tell the difference between the politicians and the bureaucrats, and also how that they all were defending their particular institutional interests to the degree that they were prepared to criticise each other's local deals. And I think that's what is actually, I know I'm supposed to be doing this as an academic, but I think that's what is actually depressing about the whole process, is that it is, as Layla was saying, so fundamentally disconnected from people's everyday lives and what they think of as them having influence over the way they live, and the local environment they live in, and the jobs and transport systems and their salaries and all these issues. That this actually has absolutely nothing to do with it, and it has, as I said at the beginning, absolutely nothing to do with democracy.
Thank you very much, Martin.
Thank you. Ariana invited me to this event, I believe, to say something about fiscal decentralisation, which might result in a few more people fleeing for the exit. I can't possibly do justice to that and the implications of this in 7 minutes. If people want to read a bit more about what research I've been conducting with my colleague Kevin Muldoon-Smith, there's a website there, we've got a blog on it, we've written a variety of different articles about some of the implications of fiscal decentralisation and devolution in City Metric, New Start magazine. There's a lot of stuff out there. We've also got a Twitter feed if you want to follow that. What I would say, first of all, Mr. Manchester, Howard Bernstein, described devolution, city deals, combined authorities as a platform for fiscal self-reliance. There's going to be winners and losers. Bob Kerslake talked about tensions. He talked about equity. We're going to get uneven development. It's pretty uneven already, and it's going to get more uneven. Martin Jones, he expressed it slightly differently to the way I would express it, but fiscal federalist geography. What we're trying to do is starting to model that, and we can't start modelling it because the devil is in the detail, and that is again an expression that was used earlier on. Read the small print. At the moment, the civil servants are writing small print. National non-domestic rates has been around a long time, but we've had creeping decentralisation through the business rate retention scheme. It's 50% in places, it's going to be 100%, you can keep everything. We've been hashtagging 100% of what? What can you keep 100% of? So this is a rather arcane subject, but it was given a new lease of life at the Conservative Party conference, coming out of the blue, literally, if you excuse the pun, when George Osborne suddenly announced local authorities can keep 100% of their business rates. The civil servants didn't know that was coming. His cabinet colleagues didn't know that was coming, and now they're desperately trying to work out what the hell he meant by that and how it's going to work. And I was reassured when Bob Kerslake earlier on talked about some of these controls, the tariff and top-up. I'm not expecting anyone to understand what tariff and top-up mechanism means, what the safety net means, what the reset means, what the revaluation means. I need to know that because I'm a surveyor, I'm a valuer. But it means there will be controls. So it will not be as extreme as some people think it will be. We know that there are some work going on in government around this. There's the DCLG consultation on business rates. There's the BETS review, which we're contributing to. But what I'll summarise in terms of where we're going and what I'm anticipating, what we're anticipating, is that it's going to create uncertainty. There's going to be huge uncertainty for local authorities in planning their income in the medium to longer term. It's going to cause a lot of problems. Where there's uncertainty, there are risks. Now, I'm not saying we're going to end up where American cities have ended up going bankrupt, but there is going to be turbulence ahead. It's very little understood. It's very difficult to forecast, not least because you can have appeals today that are backdated to before there was business rate retention handed over to local authorities. So they're picking up bills from 2006. They weren't even responsible for that at the time. So there's all these arcane operations within the system. It's very difficult to understand. In 2020, we think is going to be the point at which Osborne's announcement will really start to have some traction. That's the date that's been set. But between now and then, we just don't know what's going to happen and how this is going to emerge. So I imagine there are going to be a lot of people in local authorities waiting for this to emerge. And then it will play out. And how it will play out, we just don't know. But I'll come back to the earlier point. There will be winners and losers. There's going to be a lot of turbulence and risks for cities, city regions.
Good afternoon. I'm not from around here. You can probably tell from my accent. And I hadn't been opening my presentations with that until last weekend when I was down south. And I knew I was down south because when I went down the motorway, all the sides said south, 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 south. And someone was chatting to me, and they were from Winchester, and they thought I was from Barnsley. So I would like to clarify that I'm not from the north. I come from a country where I just heard a quip recently that to lose one Prime Minister is unfortunate, but to lose several is carelessness. So I'm not in any position to make normative or remarks about what should or shouldn't happen in relation to governance in the UK. But what I have been asked to talk about is what happens when you run a citizens' assembly on devolution. I'm part of a team from the University of Sheffield, the University of Southampton, University of College of London, Westminster University. It's all my ticks. That have, late last year, ran 2 citizens' assemblies around the issues of devolution and local governance. One in Sheffield, we call that Assembly North, and one in Hampshire and the Isle of Wight, we call that Assembly South. There are 2 aims to these citizens' assemblies. The first, with one eye on a national constitutional convention, the idea was we should perhaps run a pilot to see how we can do this well and what lessons we can learn about quality deliberation. The second and subsequent aim was to test what citizens' views of devolution in the UK might be. Now, the second of those goals wasn't originally in the plan, but with the surprise election result and the announcement of a northern powerhouse, which was linked to city mayors and devolution deals, we added that to our 2 main aims. Because of today's focus, I'll just talk about the second of the aims, and I'll talk about Assembly North because it would seem to be most pertinent to what we're discussing here. We thought it was important to look at citizens' views about devolution in the UK, partly because that's the sort of thing that might be the topic for a nationwide constitutional convention, partly because it has a lot of political currency, and also there's been a widespread criticism that there hasn't been enough public consultation around the devolution deals. Picking up on Bob Kerslake's comment before about needing to involve the people, not just people in power. If my colleague Matt Flinders was here today, he would no doubt have picked up on that comment and said that if devolution or other forms of change are going to take hold and last, they need to have democratic root. They need to be grounded in the people. So, in the pursuit of those aims, we ran our 2 assemblies. The history was that in October 2014, representatives from universities and interested organisations met at Windsor Castle, talked about what's happening with governance in the future, and this idea of running a pilot assembly was formed. We refined our focus after the election However, that introduced a time constraint with the local city's devolution bill going through Westminster, deals being announced. We didn't really have time to take the usual academic path of taking 5 years of doing anything. So we actually set up and ran the assemblies in 3 months. So by November, we completed the 2 assemblies, which was a Herculean task, I've got to say. There's 2 reasons I mentioned that. The time factor is we probably would have done a lot of things differently if we'd had 6 months to 12 months. And the other is we didn't have a formal political link with our assemblies because it's happening independent to government, and that has issues in relation to legitimacy, recruitment and those sorts of things. Now, I could go through and tell you about how the assemblies worked and that sort of thing, and composition and representation issues. Probably not time for that now. Happy to chat with you about that afterwards. But I thought I would chat to you about some of the outcomes from the assemblies. So we had 32 members in Assembly North. I think an interesting component about the assemblies was we had a strong learning and consultation component. Back home in Australia, citizens' assemblies get pretty bad press. We've had 2 prime ministers get, to use a colloquialism, slapped around because they've even sort of tried to oppose the idea because they seem to be populist and excluding experts and not involving, or basically trying to do what Parliament isn't doing properly. An important component about our assemblies was exposure to information prepared by the House of Commons Library. Experts in the field, so Andy and Ariana were kind enough to come along and give their time. We had Diana came along, I'm not sure whether Diana came and presented, Nigel came and presented. We also had Steve Houghton came along to talk about the process. John Mothersole came and spoke about the negotiations, and also Mike Emmerich, who was involved in the Manchester deal. So we tried to provide a broad range of information to put the citizens in a situation where they're almost approximating what would you do if you were a decision maker? What would you come up with? And the outcomes, there was a series of, I suppose, what we would call ideal scenarios. What would you have if powers were devolved? And they decided on a regional assembly around Yorkshire and the Humber. We were a little surprised about that given the vote in the North East, but that's what they decided. They decided the form that they wanted was a Scottish or Welsh powers with the First Minister. And interestingly, they also decided they wanted tax-raising powers, not law-making powers. There was a very close vote on law-making powers and there was some abstentions. So the 3 clear messages around their ideal model for those 3 things. But we also put to them the very pragmatics of the devolution deals that were in front of them. They were not happy with the city mayor. They rejected the notion of an elected city mayor. They also rejected the notion of the city deals as they currently stood. However, what was interesting was they were calling on their civic leaders to negotiate further and to get better deals. Now, the results of these is probably not the major issue given some of the constraints we had around size and recruitment. But what's really interesting, I think, is the deliberations and the discussions that went on behind these decisions. So in relation to some of today's themes, and one of those is about the capacity for public engagement in these sorts of complex policy and governance decisions. And the thing that was shone out brightly was citizens were ready, willing and able to really get stuck in and struggle and grapple with these sorts of issues. Working in politics in the past, I've heard many times, yes, it's all very nice, but citizens aren't up to it. They can't. Well, they demonstrated that they were, not only through their own self-reflection, but between the 2 assemblies. I went to the House of Commons Library, I went to politicians, I went to advocates, I went to a range of sources, and the feedback over and over again was these requests for information, these questions from the citizens are really rigorous, and we're not sure we have the answers. So that's the first thing. The second thing that was interesting about the shift in our focus towards local devolution raises new opportunities about how does public consultation occur with local government. If additional powers are going to be shifted to the local level, how are the current consultation mechanisms configured? Could citizens' assemblies fit into that? And we've had a lot of success with informal feeding into the Sheffield City region consultations. Picking up quickly on identity, because that's a big topic we've talked about. I think Martin mentioned it. I mentioned it earlier. Yes, identity was a powerful driver behind the Yorkshire and Humber decision for the regional assembly, but it was also about economics. They wanted a larger footprint. They felt they needed something big enough to attract industry internationally. They wanted Humber as access for a port. And Matt and I pick up in our chapter in the book that we'll soon get to launch in, about some of the intricacies about how the conversations shifted around identity depending on what was being talked about. One moment we're talking about is, yes, we're all from Yorkshire. Next minute we're saying, well, you didn't quite mine the right sort of materials, so we're not quite sure if you're from Yorkshire. So the conversation shifted. So there's questions about the power. Well, identity is quite powerful. Is there the power to motivate the whole Northern Powerhouse agenda? Just quickly about the mayor. Yes, they did reject the elected mayor idea, but it wasn't just because they felt it was being foisted upon them. It was because they were concerned about a mayor having an economic brief and economic accountability. Who'd pick up the social policy and the social accountability? Would there be tensions created between? How would that accountability be, I suppose, addressed? And I mean, I think the Sheffield City Council has started to pick up on some of those things. So finally, really quickly, positive to finish the day. Citizens are up for this. If they're given the information and the opportunity, they can engage, and they can engage at a rigorous level. I suppose the thing for us is our first of our two aims. How do you do it when you try and shift it to a national constitutional convention? And we've got some lessons learned about that, but that's for today.
As Brenton has kind of teed up beautifully, if you want to read more about that paper that he's talking about, it's contained in this publication, which is a e-book, but we've also produced some physical copies on the politics of the North. Really devised, it's an edited collection, a diverse range of contributions, really put together in the spirit of this event about promoting some, if not providing any answers, at least highlighting the different aspects of this conversation, as we've tried to do in terms of assembling the different kind of panels that we've had today and so on, and highlighting some of the key issues that we face. And I think that the editors of this, which is myself, Ariana, and Craig Berry from Sperry, I think we're all collectively of the view that the politics of the North is just going to be such a key feature of so many different aspects of political debate over the next few years. So providing these kind of fora for these different conversations to meet is a really important thing to do. And I think we've maybe started to do that a little bit today, although we've also maybe in doing that also highlighted some of the difficulties with doing so. And this book hopefully continues that debate. So it is primarily going to be distributed electronically, so we'll be tweeting it, sending it out to the mailing list, etc. And we'd encourage people to respond to it. There's going to be some blog posts developed off the back of this, and hopefully an ongoing dialogue involving some of you in that electronic sphere rather than in the confines of this room. But with that, given that we are so overrunning, I think we should decamp next door, where hopefully there's still some, we can decant the wine. But just one last thing to say is obviously the thanks to everyone for making such great contributions on the floor, all the panellists, our keynotes. Bob Martin's still here, has been with us all day, all made some fantastic contributions. And on a personal level, I just wanted to thank Ariana for doing so much work pulling this event together. The back end of last term, I was off sick for a number of weeks, having been in hospital, and I know that she really took the burden on sort of getting the panels assembled and everything. So thank you so much for that. Oh, and I should say once again, because this is on tape, thanks to the White Rose Consortium for providing the funding, and we might come knocking for some more. So thank you very much.